speaking of abortion. That's the other end of the ethics of creation. Not new ways of creating people, but the question of whether it's ever, and if so when, morally permissible or morally decent to end a creation that is once started. What should we think about the morality of abortion? Now, I'm not sure there's any topic in bioethics that's as polarizing and hard for people to talk about as this one. And some of that has to do, I think, with the fact that, at least in some countries, and I would put the United States among that, there's so little communication between people who have different views, right? I mean, you all know now that, when you do a Google search, it's learned who you are, so it only gives you results that you're going to like. And that's a metaphor for how we have conversations about abortion. We do selection bias. We keep talking to the people who already agree with us, and we start building up a view of the other side. And can't imagine why they have the view they have, and start to imagine, I don't know, if you're pro-choice, that people who identify as pro-life can't possibly care about women and girls who are pregnant, and that if you're pro-life, you think that people who identify as pro-choice can't possibly care about the value of early human life. When what's much closer to truth is that people disagree about how to value early human life and how to deal with the fact that that early human life needs to live in and off of a woman or girl who might be in difficult circumstances. What we want to do is sail into the really difficult issues with abortion, which tend to be issues that press both bookends. The people who, again, self-identify as pro-life without any exceptions, and the people who self-identify as pro-choice without any exceptions, okay? I dare say that for a great many of us, neither of those positions feels right. That there are examples that should keep anybody up at 3 in the morning. So there was a case of an 11-year-old pregnant in Chile, which doesn't have any exceptions for abortion. I think that's a really hard thing for a pro-life position to swallow. Then there was a case on the other side in England of a woman having legal third trimester abortion because the baby had cleft palate. I think that's really hard position for a pro-choice person to take. A few years ago, I went to an amazing conference. I was invited to speak at it called Open Hearts and Open Minds, that took up President Obama's challenge for the, again, self-identified left and right or pro-life, pro-choice groups to come together and actually have conversation. Okay. Interestingly, we were told, don't applaud, because in that context, right, that would be a political act of, yeah, we're right, it would turn into a debate, and it wasn't supposed to be a debate. When I teach abortion, we never debate, because that's going to make you dig your heels in further, where I want you to start paying attention to what feels confusing in your position and others. At any rate, there were lots of talks, no applause, but the really cool part of the conference came after the first day, when the speakers were invited to a lovely dinner with a seating chart. And the organizers intentionally pro-choice, pro-life, pro-choice, pro-life, pro-choice, pro-life, and put a big bottle of wine in the middle. It was one of the coolest dinners I've ever had. The most telling moment for me came after the bottles of wine were largely drunk, and one of the participants, as we started to have a group conversation, raised her hand, and she said, here's the question I want to ask each of us. What are we each most afraid of about the others? And that's when the conference changed. Because instead of trying to defend our positions as best we can, we're all really smart and we're scholars and we could keep going forever, instead it's trying to look at why are you pushing so hard against the others, as opposed to understanding that good and reasonable people really do disagree on this issue. And that if good and reasonable people really disagree, maybe we would learn something if we compare where we're coming from. Why do we come to that position, right? If we had enough trust in one another that we could share our own biggest ambivalences in our position. So, to me, abortion is actually, if often the most polarizing conversation in bioethics, actually the richest conversation. Because if we can get past those sorts of barriers, to have a little more humility, that this issue is really hard and I want to understand you, and I want to understand my own position more deeply, then we can really start to have a conversation and maybe get a little more wisdom. Thank you.